Hello and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. Our guest today is an author and an internist, Dr. Khameer Kidia. And in his recent book, he declares, I am calling for the end of psychiatry, or at least a kind of end. What I have in mind is more like a supernova, an explosion, large and bright enough to dissolve the field's current limits from within. That's kind of striking. We're going to introduce Dr. Kidia in a moment, but I first want to ask my colleague, Saul Wiener, to talk to us a little bit about how we came to this topic. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So tell me a little bit, how did we get attuned to the new book by Dr. Khameer Kidia, and how do we think it fits into the themes of On Becoming a Healer?
Well, in the sentence you read where he challenges psychiatry as a field, he goes on to write, my patients are not suffering from depression, they're suffering from oppression. And the book itself challenges us to look at mental illness through different lenses. And it's full of anecdotes. One that resonated for me describes a visit he made as a medical student to the home of a man who was diagnosed with hoarding. And Daniel, as he called him, was 73 years old, lived in this incredibly crowded apartment, as you would expect with someone who has a hoarding diagnosis, and had been probably falling because he was tripping over all the stuff in his home. And Cam had the opportunity to make home visits with a physician who did that and knew this patient quite well. And as Cam was stumbling through and meeting this nice man who was sympathetic to the fact that it was hard to get through his apartment without tripping, started to reflect on how there's so much hoarding in our society that we don't label as pathologic. And he reflected on the billionaires who hoard. He reflected on the Jeff Bezoses of the world, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, all of whom hoard stuff. They hoard their private jets and their yachts. And one of the things about their hoarding is it's not harmless. Cam writes, quote, I knew from my textbooks that a behavior such as gambling or eating or drinking could become pathological when it is harmful to either the patient or others. So why was the harmful hoarding of billionaires normal? What made Daniel, with his harmless piles of People magazines, diseased when Jeff Bezos, who hoards more than $200 billion made on the backs of underpaid contingent warehouse workers who are twice as likely to be injured as other warehouse workers, consistently receives honors for his hoarding? I realized that hoarding disorder, much like schizophrenia among Black men or borderline personality disorder among women, was a diagnosis unevenly applied to certain people, poor, insecure elderly, who hoard certain things, magazines, jars, tchotchkes. Perhaps, I thought, if rich people didn't hoard so many things of value, poor people wouldn't be driven into the precarious conditions that make it hard for them to part with things of little value. And this anecdote, in which he reflects in a big picture way, is characteristic of a number of the stories that he tells in the book that look at mental health through these different lenses. At the same time, one of the challenges I'm interested in posing is this question: how does this change what we do in our day-to-day work? We live in this pernicious world, and at the same time, we're just docs. We show up, we see patients in our clinics, in the hospital wards, and we have to work with what we have for the most part. What do I do as a doc on a day-to-day basis that I should be doing differently from what I'm doing now? And I'm hoping that today's discussion will look at both sides of that coin.
Well, thanks for that kickoff, Saul. The book that you have been pulling these observations from is called Empire of Madness, Reimagining Western Mental Health Care for Everyone. And it's written by Dr. Khameer Kidia. Can I call you Cam?
Please do.
Okay, thank you. Cam grew up in Zimbabwe. He then went to Princeton University from Zimbabwe, studied medical anthropology at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He subsequently earned his medical degree through the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He completed residency training in Boston. He has had something of a split life between Boston and Zimbabwe, carrying out at various times mental health research projects in Zimbabwe and other forms of connection to his country of origin, while also practicing as a doctor in Boston and ultimately authoring this book, which is what brings us together. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Hi, Cam.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start off with a few words of background that I think most people would be interested in, which is, can you tell us just a little bit about how you came to wind up a doctor in the United States or having grown up in Zimbabwe?
Gosh. So growing up in Zimbabwe during the 2000s was a tumultuous period of extreme political and economic upheaval. There was hyperinflation where in 2008, the inflation rate in Zimbabwe was something like 6.7 sextillion%.
Oh my goodness, I can't even say
So
that number.
in order to write that number down, you have to use moles. Remember from chemistry what moles were?
Oh,
10 to the power of 20 something. And what that meant in reality was that When we went to a coffee shop, for example, and ordered a cappuccino, that first cappuccino would be 4 million Zimbabwean dollars. And if you sat there and, chatted to your friends for another hour and ordered another cappuccino, while you were sitting there, the second cappuccino would be $8 million. And if you had one more cappuccino in an hour, the next cappuccino would be $16 million. And so money became meaningless. And the effect of all of this on the people of the country was devastating from a mental health perspective. In the 2000s, researchers who were measuring the prevalence of depression and anxiety disorders put the figure of somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population. People in Zimbabwe were extremely distressed, pushed further into the margins of poverty, and were really, really suffering. And so that was kind of this period that I was growing up in. And my parents wanted a better life for us. We came from a fairly upper middle class background, but my parents couldn't afford the trappings of that lifestyle in a setting like that. And so they wanted me to go overseas for college and couldn't afford to do that. The University of Zimbabwe was constantly on and off strike and wasn't really an option of a place to study. And so I ended up applying to universities all over the world. And I looked at places that gave scholarships, and the US is very generous to international students in some institutions. And that's how I ended up here. I'd never been
Okay.
to the US before. I sort of just packed my bags up and they paid for my plane ticket. And I got on a flight with my two bags and left my parents at home. And that was my first time in the US.
Yeah, in your book, you describe arriving and maybe fairly early on going shopping at something like a Walmart or a Target. Is my memory correct that you suddenly saw this world of plenty and things that were affordable?
The first time I walked into Walmart, I could not believe what I saw. Aisle upon aisle of stuff. So much stuff that was the same. There were hundreds of different lamps that I could put in my dorm room. And I remember seeing these things and thinking, wow, what is this twisty tentacle lamp with all the different colors? Where do they come up with this stuff? And how is there so much of it? Back home at the same time, our grocery stores were deplete of goods because there was nothing around. Zimbabwe wasn't manufacturing anything because the economy had come to a halt. Imported goods were so deathly expensive that no one could afford them. We would wait in long lines just to get a loaf of bread or to put gas in our car. The contrast was so, so stark for me.
Were you a pre-med from the start?
I'd always wanted to be a doctor, but I never thought it would be possible because the barriers for an international student to become a doctor in the US are so incredibly high. So I had a sort of interesting path at that point. I don't know if you've heard of this program. It's called the Humanities and Medicine Early Admissions Program at Mount Sinai.
Yes.
But it is a program that you apply to at the beginning of your sophomore year of college. And if you get in, you get a guaranteed place in medical school for when you graduate on condition that you essentially never study science as an undergraduate.
Oh,
I studied French literature as an undergraduate because I was in this program.
did French literature speak to your later interest in mental health or mental distress, or what drove that interest for you in mental health and mental distress?
I think French literature was a lens for seeing how important language and culture were in medicine and health.
Okay.
But what really made me interested in mental health in particular was my personal relationship to it within my family and the way that I had seen it bearing down in terms of like a psychological toll on the members of my family. And
Yeah.
in particular, my mother, who becomes the protagonist of this book.
You spent some time thinking about potentially going into psychiatry or internal medicine as a medical student.
I was split between the two until the last moment. I applied in both psychiatry and internal medicine, and I got letters of recommendations in both, and I did sub internships in both. And it was towards the end of my fourth year of medical school when I was on this rotation in LGBTQ psychiatry, and I was doing psychiatric assessments or helping and attending to do psychiatric assessments for trans people wanting gender affirming
Yes.
care. And I remember giving out these diagnoses of gender dysphoria and thinking to myself, well, that's a useful thing to be able to do to help this person get access to what they needed. But when I thought about people back home in Zimbabwe and psychiatry and its role in that system and in that politics, I realized that psychiatry didn't have the same kind of social power. You couldn't give someone a diagnosis of PTSD or of gender dysphoria that could help them to access social services. And so it felt sort of disempowering to become an American psychiatrist and then take that back to Zimbabwe because already you're disempowered in the options that are available to your patients afterwards. Not only can you not give them access to social services or to gender affirming care, but you have very little access to the types of treatments that we have in Western psychiatry. There are only a handful of psychiatric drugs available in Zimbabwe, and the system is so limited by the 14 psychiatrists who are working there that to become the 15th Zimbabwean psychiatrist to me,
Oh my God.
it just didn't feel like I would be able to do meaningful work on a systems level. And that's not to say that I didn't think psychiatry was very important, but I was really thinking about things back home when I made the decision to go into internal medicine.
There certainly are some harsh criticisms of how people with mental illness are treated in Zimbabwe. Repeatedly in your book, you come back to a healthcare system that often consigns people with mental illness to jails or to prisons or to prison like environments. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. You know, early on in my research career in Zimbabwe, I got working on a health systems analysis of the mental health system in Zimbabwe and going out into rural areas and talking to psychiatrists at community hospitals and psychiatric facilities and forensic facilities, interviewing policymakers. And something that kept coming up was the forensic system in Zimbabwe, where patients who had committed crimes, who were mentally ill, got put into prisons with hospitals or hospitals with prisons. Those were the two types of institutions that they could go to. And within those settings, human rights abuses were completely rife. In Chikurubi prison in Harare, it was common for 30 to 40 men to be in small cells of just a few feet wide and a few feet long with one toilet and no care psychiatrically whatsoever. And there was a lot of sexual violence. The HIV prevalence was really high, very little hygiene, epidemics of cholera and gastroenteritis flowing through. And so, really appalling conditions that Doctors Without Borders started to notice when people in the system started to raise flags about what was going on and ended up sending a whole team of people to work on the prison human rights situation for mentally ill patients in Zimbabwe. And I became swept up in this need to take human rights to the global south where I was from. I couldn't believe all of these human rights abuses. What I didn't realize at the time was how the American system of mental health and prisons is in many ways not that different. And that was something that I learned later on from working within the American medical system and seeing what some researchers call carcerality and the way that prisons and psychiatric hospitals have so much in common. You know, they have a revolving door. Patients who, are admitted to psychiatric hospitals often get readmitted and they don't get their problems solved in the same way that rehabilitation in a prison often just leads to recidivism. People who have committed crimes don't end up not committing crimes after they've had some period in prisons or jails. And then the way that those systems work to control people, putting everyone in the same uniform, controlling their every habit and lives, and cutting them off from their very social worlds that help to protect their mental health. These are things that prisons and psychiatric hospitals in America have in common with those institutions in other places in the world. So what I realized was that the problem was actually global and universal, not unique to low income or global south
Yeah.
countries.
And I remember as a medical student in a very good psychiatric hospital or psychiatric unit, we had people who were taken off the streets when they were at their worst, stabilized for a week to 2 weeks, and then sent back out. And then they would return. And I remember speaking to one of the instructors and saying, I'm really kind of confused about this. What are we fixing here? And he's like, well, we reestablish a degree of homeostasis. That was the expression. And then when we reestablish that, we let them go until that disintegrates again. And then we reestablish it again. I was like, okay. That's not a terrible mission, but it also seems kind of hollow. And I felt that way at the time. It was distressing to see people in the throes of extreme distress.
What's interesting to me there is this expression of homeostasis, which we know from physiology is a biological thing. The idea that you can homeostase someone's emotional state is to me part of the issue of psychiatry in crisis and trying desperately to draw on science to give validity to some of its practices when really we should be questioning whether those practices are scientifically based at all.
So, a lot of your book focuses on the idea that an enormous component of human mental distress is constructed by the social world in which we live. And repeatedly, you return to exploitation, to material deprivation that people suffer from, to poverty. And I guess one could read your book and think that these social conditions, in particular poverty, are so driving of mental distress that it would be almost impossible for somebody who is well off, middle class, maybe even from families like yours and mine, to have something that might be a mental illness. So I want to understand a little bit, how is it possible that somebody who seems to be in a relatively empowered position could suffer from mental distress that we diagnose perhaps as schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder?
Yeah. There's great data from Pickett and Wilkinson, who are social epidemiologists, and they wrote a book quite a few years ago now called The Inner Level. And it argues that part of the reason that the prevalence of mental illness is so high in a place like the United States, the richest country in the world, where there are lots of resources, is due to inequality, to the difference between the people at the top and at the bottom that affects both people at the top and at the bottom. Living in an extremely hierarchical society puts a lot of pressure on the people at the top of that hierarchy and has a psychological bearing in the same way that the material circumstances of the people at the bottom of that hierarchy end up affecting their psychology. They have this theory that's based on an idea called status anxiety, the idea that we are always comparing ourselves to someone who is higher up than us in the social hierarchy. They give certain biological hypotheses for how that may be linked, like cortisol spikes. But the basic hypothesis is that inequality is harmful both to people who are rich and to people who are poor.
Hmm.
I think one of the anecdotes that Cam describes is caring for the privileged and the worried well, the kind of panic and anxiety they feel at the perception of loss of control, and how they want to be referred to best specialists of, I need to talk to the hospital administrator, and that kind of panic and anxiety that you fear that you see among the privileged when they feel a threat to their well-being.
I have this friend who, since college, has made tons and tons of money and is living this lavish life in Silicon Valley, but is living in extreme fear and extreme anxiety. And it keeps moving house and getting bigger houses with more and more security and security guards and electric fences. Because what happens is more you have, the more you have to lose. And so when you're hoarding stuff, you get anxious about losing the stuff. And that is a pathological psychological mechanism called rumination that we know about, that we study.
My mother immigrated from Egypt. She was part of a Jewish enclave of sorts, of fairly bourgeois. And having come to this country, I was very fortunate in how I was brought up. But the dislocation that she describes is from a world in which she understood who the community was, who knew who, everybody knew everybody in that little world. And it was almost like a little bit of a village, and there was a set of standards. And then arriving in a world like California, it's perfectly plentiful. There's a lot to be admired about life there. But this disintegration of a social world has been something that she talked about with me many, many times. There's no fixity like what she grew up with, and it's been a source of real distress. And I'm wondering if you're, in a way, alluding to that as a difference between some of the restorative aspects of communities, even in the global South, and some of what you've seen here.
Your mother's experience is so common. In the book, I talk about Afro-Caribbeans who migrate from the Caribbean to the UK. And when they do so, develop a 15 times greater chance of being diagnosed with schizophrenia than the general population in the UK. Even though back home in the Caribbean, the incidence of schizophrenia remains low. So what that tells you is that the reason that they are at an increased risk of developing schizophrenia has nothing to do with their genetics, because back
Hmm.
home, folks have the same low incidence of schizophrenia. It has everything to do with a change of their social conditions, coming to a place where capitalism is more cutthroat, where racism is more prevalent, where people are struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis, and where people are atomized from their communal lives, which sounds a lot like the experience that your mother had.
Yeah,
Another
absolutely.
hypothesis that is in the epidemiological literature is the healthy migrant hypothesis, which is the idea that to even have the wherewithal to move out of your country when your country is in distress, you have to have some level of psychological resilience.
That is strongly described in cultural literature.
Exactly. So there are these two kind of competing hypotheses
Yes.
for what can happen with migration and mental illness.
One thing to acknowledge there is that the healthy person who says we are immigrating often drags along people who have no desire to immigrate, except that they're the dependents of the one who decides to immigrate. I mean, my
Right.
mom certainly didn't ask to be an immigrant. She was forced to be an immigrant. And that wasn't by choice at all. And I think that's part of the original injury, at least that she describes to us. One thing that I think is going to come up for people listening to this, and it certainly came up for me in reading your book, is you do describe how the symptoms of mental distress are so variable across cultures and countries and across environments. And yet, many of us think of mental illness as a biologically modifiable phenomenon with biological correlates in the brain. There's something to do with dopamine or serotonin or inheritance that contributes to the propensity to develop a diagnosable mental illness. So is there actually mental disease, or are we just all distressed because of circumstances? And is this stuff biological at all, or is mental illness is just a social reaction?
Of course, it's biological too, Stefan. It's biological in the sense that there are neurochemicals in your brain when you have depression, when you have anxiety, that sometimes you can map those things onto an fMRI scan. But that doesn't mean that those chemicals or what you see on a scan is the source of the problem or the
Hmm.
cause of the problem. That is just a reflection. And mental health and mental illness are so much more complicated than the biological dimension that you can't really extricate the biology from the social. We are all literally part of our social worlds. When I think about the way our social worlds have bearing on our symptoms of mental illness, I really like to go back to the study done by Tanya Luhrmann, who is a
Oh,
psychiatrist.
good. I was going to ask about this exactly.
Yeah, she is a brilliant researcher and has this incredible paper that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in the 2000s and 10s, where she and her colleagues looked at voice hearing amongst people with schizophrenia in three different countries: the US, Ghana, and India. And in those groups, they asked people what the content of their auditory hallucinations was like. And in the US, folks said things like, it's very distressing, very violent. Things like command auditory hallucinations that tell me to stick a fork into a person's eye or kill this person or slit this person's throat. Really nasty things. But in Ghana and India, on the other hand, the voices that people heard were often relational. They sounded like a family member, a mother or a brother, or they were spiritual. They sounded like the voice of God. So people didn't have the same intrusive ideas about what these voices meant. In fact, some people in the study said the voices helped them make good decisions and told them to do the right thing in life, like make your bed, tidy your room. The voices that people hear are socially and culturally inflected. The writer Rachel Aviv says, no delusion is spun from pure fantasy. Even the most grand delusions have to come from some social and cultural world.
Hmm.
And that is the case even for schizophrenia. That was the type of data that really rocked my world, trying to reckon with these things during my training and trying to reckon with the models that were being given to me by psychiatry, a very biologically deterministic model for understanding these problems.
So our social world can influence exactly how even something like hearing voices occurs. And I certainly recognize that when we are admitting patients to our wards and we hear they're hearing voices, we assume a negative valence to those voices right away at the time of admission. We start to think we're going to call psychiatry. Are these command hallucinations? Are they telling you to kill somebody? Like the entire thing goes to this negative domain. But what you're describing actually is that in another cultural context, those voices might be not particularly distressing. They could be a feature of the brain that is not 100% wanted, but also potentially comforting even at times.
Yes. And what Lerman says is that if the voices are more benign, the outcome is more benign. Because if you are less distressed by what you are hearing, then you're not going to be as impaired. And that actually bears out in the data too. If you look at the really large studies that were done by the World Health Organization from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they followed more than 1,000 patients in 10 different countries who had schizophrenia and showed that in some global south countries like Nigeria and India, people who had far less access to antipsychotics than folks in the UK or the US had way better functioning outcomes. They were more integrated in their communities and had symptoms that were less troublesome to them than patients with schizophrenia in the US and the UK and in other global north countries. And so one reason could be the culture has an effect on the voices that those people hear. If those voices are more benign, then they have more benign outcomes. Other reasons could be the role of the family. When we have someone with schizophrenia in the US in a nuclear family with 4 people in it and everyone has to go out to work every day or to school, what do we do with the person who has schizophrenia? Well, they have to be institutionalized because there's no way to care for them. But in a multi generational family home, say in rural India, there are other types of social structures that could integrate that person into daily life in a way that doesn't marginalize them and put them further out of their caring system. And so that is another reason. There are various hypotheses, but the data over and over again consistently shows that people with schizophrenia in the global south have better outcomes than people with schizophrenia in the global north, where they have access to antipsychotics.
And you talk about how in the society in which we live, we're looking for ways to use medication so that everybody else can keep moving on with their lives, which are generally very focused on productivity. And so that difference in what the communities prioritize and how they're structured has a profound effect on what the options are. You also write about how farmers have been dying by suicide in India as a result of debt, and that initially the government treated them with antidepressants and tried to ban fertilizers that people were using to kill themselves. You describe actually 400,000 suicide deaths by farmers in India over a period of years that occurred because they were forced into debt because of global pressures to change the way in which they purchase seeds that put them in an impossible situation. And that debt completely derailed the relationships they had in their community, which in turn made their lives seem impossible. And many of them wrote suicide notes. You quote some of those. So this is not a hypothesis, it's what they said.
You take away the weapon they could use to kill themselves, so they won't kill themselves because you took that thing away. It's like taking away the gun of a suicidal person. Are you against that, Saul?
I think that in India, when people are dying because of debt, we need to take the debt away.
And the Indian government has realized this and now is providing debt relief for farmers. They have realized after years and years of seeing this suicide problem as a psychiatric problem, have understood what those suicide notes are saying. And they're providing some degree of debt relief to those farmers. I don't think it's enough, but it is recognition on an institutional level that debt is actually what is driving those suicides. And that is a problem that is also global. We have
Yep.
farmer suicide in the US and in Australia and all over the place. And a lot of that is driven by economic circumstances and by farm sector debt.
And in the States, we create an environment in which people think that having guns is a great thing. And then ultimately, that leads to death. There's an industry that's benefiting immensely from that.
There's a whole industrial complex that creates the violence that we see in the United States, the arms industry, and the way that there's an economic incentive for the US to be at war at any point in time. All of that is tied back to the same problem, which is violence. Like the problem for the farmers, the problem is debt. The problem in the US is violence. And where that violence is coming from is this military industrial complex. I like to trace these issues that we see affecting our patients in clinic all the way back to the systems that create those issues in the first place.
So I think that what's interesting here is you talked about in the beginning of the book conceptual competence. When we train future physicians, we want them to understand the source of the problems that they're trying to treat. And currently, we don't do that. That's missing right now, particularly around mental health. And it gets back to this question that came up that I mentioned at the beginning of what can we expect of physicians? They're busy. They're seeing a patient every 20 minutes. They're part of a system. They have a set of tools and a set of resources. They can't change capitalism. They can't change violence in America. They can certainly counsel patients to get guns out of their home, which we do. And so it gets back to that question. So if you achieve conceptual competence, how does that change or how might that change the way you practice medicine or the way you teach people to practice medicine?
Well, I think that idea of conceptual competence is one of the most critical things that we can be doing right away in medical education. It comes from this psychiatrist philosopher, Avais Aftab, who's at Case Western Reserve in Ohio. What he points to is how we have improperly taught our medical students what psychiatric diagnoses are. And that goes all the way through psychiatric residency. We have not really taught that if someone has anxiety, that anxiety is not caused by generalized anxiety disorder. These disorders are not causative. They are nosological or categorical buckets that we use in medicine to help us group them and understand what we would call their illness course. And it can give us ways of talking to the patient about what might happen to them, about where they could find relief. But all of that is just based on clinical experience. It's based on what we have seen with this group of people over time. And that keeps changing over time with every edition of the DSM, ADD, ADHD. All of these things keep changing names. These diagnoses are not causative things that have a biological basis in our brains. There is no chemical imbalance. I think we need to be much more honest about what the diagnoses are offering our patients. The diagnosis can be therapeutic in and of itself, to know that you're not alone, to know that there are other people that are going through what you're going through, other people you could turn to for peer support. These are all really important positive things about having a psychiatric diagnosis. But we also need to be honest with our patients about what that diagnosis is, as it is not the biological cause of what is going on in your brain. And then we need to be honest about the therapeutic options that we have available, even antipsychotics for schizophrenia. You know, antipsychotics for schizophrenia are where the dopamine hypothesis for schizophrenia came from in the first place. We made
Right.
the drug first and then reverse engineered the theory based on what we saw. And that drug does dampen some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. But schizophrenia is not just about the positive symptoms, it's about the negative symptoms and the cognitive symptoms. And some of those drugs actually make the cognitive symptoms worse.
Yes.
And I haven't quite found the right way to explain that to patients. We need
Yeah.
to really be thinking hard about the way we communicate with our patients and be more honest. The other thing that I think is important is empathy. We need to be listening to our patients. That can have a therapeutic effect in and of itself. In medical school, I was taught to model empathy. In step 2 clinical skills, we were given these standardized patients and we're supposed to put a hand on a shoulder, say something caring, and then you get a tick box and you pass your exam.
Yes, it must have been hard for you, Cam.
That is the part of medical school that I did the worst in. I couldn't fake empathy. And that is because empathy cannot be faked. Empathy needs to be something that you engender. How do we engender our trainees to have empathy? We treat medical students with dignity. We treat residents as though they are humans. We don't dehumanize them. We give them work hours that are acceptable to a normal person. We give them space to be reflective in their clinical worlds. In residency, we had this program called Patient Doctor um, in our primary care program and really reinforced by our program director, Amy Ship, where we had every Friday 1.5 hours of just 10 to 12 of us with Amy and a psychiatrist, where we could just talk about whatever we wanted to. And just having that reflective space, at first I thought was something that wasn't changing the system about the way
Yeah.
medical education.
Yeah, you're just ventilating.
Yeah, exactly. You're just kind of like getting it out there. But in a system that has no reflective space, giving a reflective space and giving voice and an empathetic ear to your trainees, that is a type of change of the system. We've also had other things within our residency program, like these wellness lunch sessions, where they give us greasy slices of pizza and tell us to be well for an hour. They'll give us a lecture about sleep and sleep hygiene in residency instead of actually giving us time to sleep.
Yeah, I would take a nap through that lecture.
Those are contrived ways of giving people reflective space. Amy and the way that she was giving us reflective space was much more open and honest to what was going on. And if there was something broken in our system that she could fix, she would try and help us fix it. And then we could help each other out. If someone had a death in their family, we would offer to cover a
Fix
shift or that kind of thing.
So, Saul, a lot of residencies have tried hard to become more humane. Is there something that we could do in med school and residency that would be responsive to making better healers now?
Well, I agree that we need to make medical training more humane. And I do think we tend to infantilize medical students. We treat them like they're in 10th grade. People know when they're being talked down to. And residents, to some degree, are just worker bees. And what you described with Amy is a wonderful alternative to that. One thing I find very helpful about this conversation, and it's something I've reflected on, is that when you develop conceptual competence, you become less judgmental towards people. If it's a wealthy, privileged person who's whining and complaining and asking for the administrator, you understand where their panic is coming from. And if it's a poor, marginalized person who's yelling at you because they hate the food on their plate when you've been doing everything you can to care for them, you start to appreciate that everybody's coming from a certain place. And once you get there, become non-judgmental, you're open to engaging with them, to relating on a level playing field. And once you do that, you then start to care about them. And once you care about them, you become invested in their well-being. And medicine becomes a joy, and you start wanting to do what you can to help them. I personally don't use the term empathy because I find
Why
empathy a
not?
confusing concept. I'm not sure I'm empathic. I don't know if I have any idea what my patients are feeling. So I don't think of myself as empathic. I think of myself as somebody who can become quite caring once I connect with people. And if I'm not judgmental, then I'm more likely to do that. And I get joy out of connecting with people from all ilks. And that's one of the joys of being a physician. And for that reason, I don't use the term empathy. And I realize people have different ideas of what they mean by that term.
Hmm.
But the process that I'm describing is the one that I find leads me to enjoy my work and to be present for my patients and to want the best for them. And when I sit down with them, to simply want to problem solve together. What can we do to sort things out here? And that's the reward of being a physician.
Cam, do you have any reactions to that in particular?
Yeah, my main reaction is how unusual that is these days. Empathy is a word that I have had sleepless nights over because
Mm.
when you realize that you never fully share your patient's experience, but what you're talking about, Saul, the just sitting down and being quite practical, reflexive, and just providing a listening ear. These things are all components of what I have come to now think of as an empathetic clinical encounter. But what I am dismayed by is how uncommon that is or how difficult that is to practice in today's corporatized healthcare
Yeah.
systems.
I often also have problems with the statement that we should, quote, be listening to our patients because the question is, what do we mean by listening? And I think to me, listening really is about the questions you ask patients. The term listening alone gives the wrong impression often, I think, that you're supposed to just sit there and, quote, listen. And what often happens is medical students will be like, well, they just went off on a long tangent and I was told not to interrupt them and we didn't get anything done. A good listener picks up on discrepancies, picks up on clues, and asks incisive questions. And when you start to ask incisive questions, like you were so invested in getting to that cardiology appointment last time we talked, and yet I noticed you missed that appointment. What happened? That's a question that then will open up a window. And then you start to discover that the patient's actually scared of going. Or it could be more banal that their car got impounded and they don't have a ride. Or it could be that they're now caring for a sick family member. Who knows? But once you pick up on that, you observe that. And asking incisive questions is, to me, the essence of caring because it shows that you're paying attention. You're not just passively listening. You're noticing and you're asking questions that show that's the ultimate in caring. If that's what people mean by just being a good listener, fine. But I think people often misunderstand that. It's
Okay.
much more than that.
I love that. Do you have a formula, Saul, for coming up with a good question? Other than making sure a question isn't close-ended and that a question isn't leading, how can we be asking better questions of our patients?
I think we just ask questions whenever we notice something that warrants a question. Often that's a discrepancy. It's a disconnection
Discrepancy.
between something you observe and something somebody says. And you realize that maybe there's something important going on there that warrants exploring during a visit.
We have a past episode where I had a patient admitted to the hospital who was hoping to enter residential treatment for a variety of addictions. And very shortly after entering the hospital, they wanted to leave, and it was kind of unexplained, and it wasn't due to failure to provide medication. And I adopted this posture of, we'll support you in whatever you decide. And in the episode, Saul said, why didn't you ask? You said this mattered to you. Now you're saying you have to go. what's going on? And
Right.
it's more challenging. It sounds like a confrontation, but it's a discrepancy. And it was one
Mm.
of the lessons of that episode, actually, for me.
Medical students or residents will say to me, that seems antagonistic.
Yes,
And I would
can.
say you're actually doing your job. If you don't ask that question, you're not doing your job. And I've never had a patient get angry when I've asked these questions. I just say, hey, I noticed that A and then B. I'm curious, like what's happened? Why did you say that and then do this? To me, that's caring. That is what caring is. And I don't experience any empathy. I have no idea what that person's life is like or what they're experiencing or feeling. But getting back to the question of how do we draw on the work that you've been doing, Cam, around thinking about the multidimensionality of mental health, both where people's mental health challenges come from and how we frame those challenges. For me personally, it takes away judgmentalism. It allows me to look at the ways in which my patients behave, whether they're rich or poor or marginalized or not, is understanding that these people are deeply affected by the system in which we live, and also to be cautious of compartmentalizing them with these diagnoses. As you put it aptly, generalized anxiety disorder doesn't cause anxiety. Anxiety is what gives us generalized anxiety disorder. The labels can be useful in some cases. They can help us make some decisions clinically, but they can lead us to pigeonhole people and greatly diminish the nuance and the complexity of why they behave the way they do.
That resonates a lot with me. On a clinical encounter standpoint, those are the important takeaways. But I do think physicians in general need to understand that they have a political role in our society. Society regards you in a certain way, and people listen to what doctors say, and we cannot take that with a grain of salt. We have to be careful with our authority and how we use it. But we also have to advocate for structural and system changes. And we can do that by having conversations about what those changes could look like, in the hopes that when we have conversations like this, that filters out into our wider culture and eventually into policy and public health messaging. I just got back from Italy. And Italy is such a fascinating place because they abolished psychiatric hospitals in 1978. There are no psychiatric hospitals in Italy, and they're doing just fine. And they did that because a small group of determined people, as Margaret Mead says, felt like they could change the world. There was a psychiatrist called Franco Basaglia, after which Basaglia law was named, which was the law to abolish all of the mental asylums in Italy. And it wasn't something that happened overnight. It was doctors talking to each other and understanding their political role in society and slowly realizing that they had a role to play and then working to change the way that things were. It started in the 1960s until the law was passed in 1978. It took another 20 years for them to gradually shut all of these mental asylums down. And now, in a place like Trieste, Italy, which is a famous model, a place that originally had 1,200 psychiatric beds, they now only have around 30 community mental health beds for acute crisis. And they've built a whole system of community services, community mental health centers, and crisis response teams that help people who are experiencing distress within their homes, with their families, integrated into care. They provide employment opportunities and peer support and all of these social services and structures that are outside of the healthcare system. And the reason that they're doing that is because doctors said this is not just a medical problem, this is a social problem too. So doctors have to do the same thing in the US. We have to say this is not just a medical problem, this is a social problem too, so that our state can understand it as such. And it even has repercussions on a cost effectiveness level. It's far cheaper to take care of mentally ill patients in Italy than it is in the US, because in the US, the mainstay of what we do is hospitalization. And hospitalization comes at a cost of at least $2,000 a night per patient. It's much more cost effective to take care of patients within their communities. And so looking at these models from other parts of the world is another important thing.
I agree with you. And I think the example of how change occurs, what Margaret Mead said and what you described in Italy is true. But what I'm also trying to say is most doctors around the country are just people going to work every day, working in offices, seeing patients every 15 or 20 minutes. And they don't have much of a mindset or time commitment to try to go solve the world's problems, so to speak.
Yeah.
There was a enormous amount of discussion about social determinants of health before the most recent presidential election. Medical schools were building SDOH into their curricula. And one of the frustrations I would hear from medical students and residents is Geesh, what am I supposed to do? My patient is unhoused, my patient is food insecure, but I can't fix those problems. And I have 15 minutes with the patient and their blood pressure's high and they've got diabetes and I got to deal with that. What I'm trying to say is that for the vast majority of physicians, if any of them are listening, is if you're willing to go out and help change the world, that's fantastic. And we need people to do that. But if you're not, at least what we want you to understand
Hmm.
is why your patients have the problems that they do. These are manifestations of a system which does immense harm to people. Even if you don't have the time to do anything about it, if you see that, Godspeed.
That's exactly right. What you're saying, Saul, is that doctors should be politicized. In other words, they should understand that health is political. It is related to the socio-political structures around us, and you cannot divorce it from that. And that sounds radical or contentious, but that is ultimately the essence of what you're getting at is
Yep.
if we can understand what is truly ailing our patients, not have to put the burden on ourselves to fix all of those problems, because how, of course, could we do that as individual clinicians in our clinics with our patients? But if we can at least understand the root causes of so many of their problems, that will change so much.
And you'll enjoy being a doctor more. When you're caring for somebody who's irritating or contentious, you see it through a larger lens and you appreciate that this person is struggling with a lot of stuff. And it doesn't frighten you. It doesn't make you pull back. It's not about you.
The reality that humans exploit one another for advantage has a rather long history. It's been remarked upon in every culture by philosophers and leaders, from every nation. Ibn Khaldun of Tunisia, 1332 to 1406, wrote, "It is in the nature of human souls to seek superiority over others." We live in a brutal world. Is there something unique that doctors are going to do to change what Ibn Khaldun wrote about in 1335?
I think Cam has answered that question with his
How?
description of Italy, that societies can change, that societies can confront their fascism and they can change. And that there's a process for that. It's a political process and it involves power struggle. And so, yes, I think the answer is, yeah, we can change. We can do better.
And I'll push back on the idea that any of this is set in human nature, because we have examples from all sorts of societies around the world. For example, in the Amazon, non-hierarchical societies that don't put some people on top of other people, where the culture is to be non-hierarchical. And there's data that some of those societies, people live longer and have less hypertension. And Pickett and Wilkinson hypothesized that that might be because there's less status anxiety, because there's less hierarchy, and so people are less stressed out. But I do think that what you say, Stefan, does resonate with an element of truth. And that is because, yes, there is violence and there is exploitation. And those have always been a feature of history. And there have also been more exploitative and more violent periods and cultures and societies than others. And so
Okay.
what we should be aiming for is to imagine a world where it could be less than what it is today. If you look at the way capitalism is structured today in our society, it's much more cutthroat than it
Hmm.
used to be in the 1970s, what we call now late stage capitalism. And so I do think we can imagine a better world. We feel as though the way things are today is the way that they always have been, and that the way that they always will be. But
Yes.
history shows us that is not the case. And so we need to broaden our imaginations. We need to bring imagination into the work that we do in medicine and in research, and imagine things that might sound out of the realm of possibility, but work towards them.
Wow. I've had a tough couple of months, and I think, Cam, you've reduced my cynicism by a meaningful percentage in the course of this conversation, for which I wish to say thank you.
Beautifully said. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on.
I loved it so much. Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.